Did you know that the frequency of close encounters in the South China Sea has increased by over 50% in the last 2 years alone? In the context of the intensifying rivalry between the United States and China, is conflict imminent in the South China Sea? This is what we will discuss in today's video. To fully grasp the gravity of the situation, we need to understand why the South China Sea is so important.
Let's talk about the fight over the South China Sea. It's rich in oil and gas, there are loads of fish, and the shipping lanes are some of the busiest in the world.
This region is a critical global shipping lane.
Around 40% of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through the South China Sea, from the Gulf, through the Indian Ocean, and onto places like China. The amount of trade that sails through there is worth $3 trillion a year, 1/3 of the world total.
The US Energy Information Administration, or EIA, estimates that the South China Sea has about 11 billion barrels of oil and 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves beneath the waters. The South China Sea is also rich in fishing resources. A significant portion of the economy of the littoral states depend on the South China Sea. Therefore, the stakes are incredibly high.
China has been a land-based power for millennia, so it's never had much of a navy, not like the colonial powers, nor has China needed one until now. Today, China wants to be a naval force across two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. That's to make sure it can trade with the rest of the world and get enough oil and gas to drive its economy. And to do that, Beijing wants to control the South China Sea. We're talking about China's 9-dash line. Back in 1929, the Chinese took a bunch of old British sailing charts and told cartographers to draw China's borders. One of them drew 9 dashes around the entire South China Sea. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, that was that.
Over the last 70 plus years, the line's taken on a life of its own, and in Beijing at least, the meaning has steadily expanded, so that today, China's not just claiming the islands inside it, it's claiming all the waters, all the seabed, all the airspace.
China's 9-dash line claim, which covers most of the South China Sea, has been a point of contention for years, but all other states have rejected China's claims. But it is not just about China. 4 members of ASEAN, namely Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, also claim various parts of the South China Sea. Each claimant state has its own mix of economic interests, national security concerns, and historical claims. Let us look at the number of incidences that have occurred in the South China Sea. As we can see in this figure, since 2000 until 2024, clearly there has been an increase in the number of these types of incidents, these close encounters, near conflicts, and other forms of skirmishes involving naval vessels, coast guards of China, and aircrafts and others. In total, there has been 195 incidences in the South China Sea since 2010 until July of 2024, with 35 of them taking place between January 2023 until July of this year alone. So clearly, there has been a dramatic step up in terms of these near conflicts. One of the scholars who have studied this US-China rivalry in detail is Graham Allison. In fact, he wrote a book entitled Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? In this book, he studied 16 different conflicts between rising powers and established powers throughout 500 years of human history. And what he found was, out of these 16, 12 of them ended in conflict. So what does it tell us? It tells us that conflict has been the norm rather than the exception. But of course, the book also suggests that it is indeed possible for peaceful resolution because after all, 4 out of those 16 incidences were resolved peacefully. Now, having said that, let us revert back to the South China Sea. Are these incidences that we are witnessing in the South China Sea, these near skirmishes that I have described earlier, are they deliberate acts to provoke China into conflict? Is this a far-fetched idea? Let us look into it. Now let us examine why these incidences could actually be deliberate acts to provoke China into conflict, and why This is not a far-fetched idea. These are some of the reasons. First, strategic competition. The US and its allies view China's rise as a challenge to the existing international order, in which they are dominant powers.
The militarization of the South China Sea has grown rapidly over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It has come to a point where it's unacceptable for the United States.
By increasing pressure in the South China Sea, they might be trying to expose China's assertiveness as a threat to regional stability. This could justify stronger military presence in the region. Second, there is a precedent of proxy conflicts. Historically, as I have said earlier, great powers have engaged in proxy conflicts all around the world, basically to draw the adversaries into overextending themselves militarily or diplomatically. Third, it is probably designed to isolate China diplomatically. Number 4, it could be a way of testing the boundaries. By provoking China, the US and allies may be testing the boundaries of Chinese tolerance and resolve.
The US's main way of asserting navigational rights and freedoms is having its navy sail through the South China Sea. It also conducts military exercises in the region, sometimes with warships from France, Japan, and Australia in the Bay of Bengal.
And number 5, it could be a way of creating a pretext for intervention.
Tensions between China and the United States.
The US sailed in with 2 aircraft carrier strike groups.
It's the first time Washington sent 2 carriers for drills in the area since 2014.
And the Chinese accused the Americans of escalating things.
And finally, a conflict could be a way of undermining China's economic rise. A conflict in the region would certainly hamper China's exports and economic activities. And this could be one such objective of provoking a military conflict in this South China Sea. What could be the supporting evidence for a likely conflict? There are several. First, the dramatic increase in near clashes heightens the probability of conflict. Second, the US-China rivalry is intensifying and in fact has expanded into all areas. Number 3, there is growing disunity among ASEAN claimant states, as certain member states seem to be taking sides in the US-China rivalry. 4, there is growing distrust among the involved parties. We can see this because despite the stated intention to conclude a code of conduct in the South China Sea, these incidences have increased. Given these incidences, there is a high probability of conflict in the South China Sea, especially in key areas like the Second Thomas Shoal or Scarborough Shoal. So, we began by asking if conflict in the South China Sea is imminent. In this video, we saw that in the context of the United States-China rivalry, there are indeed strong motivations to draw China into a conflict as a way of curbing its economic and military strength. There are also historical precedents that shows that whenever a dominant power is threatened by a rising power, there is a likelihood of conflict. So in that context, I would say that there is now an increased probability of conflict in the South China Sea. I believe the next 12 to 18 months will be critical in determining whether this region can remain free of conflict or whether it will succumb and become yet another battleground in this rivalry between these 2 superpowers. But ASEAN need not sit and wait for conflict to happen. It is time for the ASEAN members, particularly the ASEAN claimant states, to stay neutral and to take steps to mitigate the possibility of inadvertent conflict in their midst. So what do you think? Do you think conflict is possible in the South China Sea? I would love to hear your comments. And if you liked this video, please hit the share, like and subscribe buttons.